One day I was listening to a podcast about Final Fantasy VI, as you do, and when the guys on the podcast started talking about a certain character I'm quite fond of, the amazing and skillful treasure hunter Locke Cole, I was very shocked at just how wrong they were about his character. Words like creep and sexist came up quite frequently, which is understandable to a point, but then it kind of went off the rails. I made this to vent my frustration for not only Locke, but Celes Share as well, who is my favorite character ever. So I hope to properly dispel any and all mischaracterization around these two. Danger, danger, spoilers ahead, watch out. My shock around general opinion on Locke is what encouraged me to make this video in the first place, so this will be the first section. As I said earlier, Locke is quite often labeled as sexist, and sometimes even as creepy. Calling him sexist is definitely understandable, especially for people who maybe haven't finished the game or missed optional scenes explaining his backstory. In many story scenes, Locke seems to check a lot of the sexist, chivalrous character boxes. For example, at the start, Locke sees Terra, a woman, and immediately decides that she needs to be protected. It's fine in a bubble, but later on during his scenario, Locke acts very chivalrously to Celes, despite the fact that she is an ex-general in the Empire, a magic user, and frankly much stronger than he is. So yes, I definitely understand why so many people think of Locke as sexist, but look a little deeper and things start to make some more sense. During an optional scene found if you enter a certain house in Kohlingen with Locke in your party, you see why he's so protective of the women we've seen so far. He used to be in a relationship with a woman named Rachel, who apparently has a very generic face. Ignoring the fact that every woman in the world of FF6 seemingly have the same face and vibe, Locke is clearly reminded of Rachel by Terra and Celes. As for why he feels the need to protect them, that's where the backstory gets interesting and important. One day, Locke brought Rachel on a treasure hunting expedition in a deep cave on Mount Colts. Rachel is clearly not as hyperfixated on treasure hunting as Locke is, but she seems to be having a good time, and definitely isn't useless. And in a complete flip of what's seen of him to that point, he's letting her follow instead of fussing over her and stopping her from doing anything too dangerous. He honestly seems a little careless, as Rachel seems to be less versed in treasure hunting skills. Well, as you may have predicted, something terrible happened. But it wasn't just Rachel falling off a ledge, but it was a falling bridge, and Locke was the one who was on it. His carelessness led him to not worry about the dangerous bridge, and Rachel ran onto the bridge to save him. It was Locke's fault that Rachel fell. She survived, but she fell into a coma and lost her memory. Her parents were understandably super upset at Locke for bringing her with him and being careless, and made sure he knew it every time he came by. But Locke kept coming to Kohlingen to check up on her, and Rachel woke up eventually and told him to never come back. From her amnesiac perspective, this strange man was regularly visiting, and every time he came, her parents got upset. So Locke, heartbroken, did as he was asked. And 1 year later, the town got attacked by the Empire, and Rachel was killed. I can only imagine how Locke must have felt in that situation, where he was drowned by guilt, with his only chance of atoning being taken away, and fate deciding to kick him while he was down by removing a small modicum of peace, the knowledge that Rachel was recovering. He had messed up more than should be possible, with no way to fix it. So he did the next best thing he could, which is making absolute sure to stop this situation from ever happening again. Upon seeing Terra at the beginning of the game, an amnesiac girl who fell down a hole in a cave, being chased by the Narsh guards to boot, he was reminded of his failure to help Rachel, and vowed to protect Terra until she got her memory back. And therein lies the reason so many people wrote Locke off as a one-dimensional sexist man character. The fact that this is so early in the game, within the first hour, gives a very strong impression. Another factor may be how soon after this Edgar is introduced. Now, Edgar is very sexist, and considering how close Locke and Edgar were introduced, it's not surprising that some people could maybe conflate their introductions, one of whom is strangely protective, and the other of whom is strangely flirtatious, with only one being explained later. But back to Locke. The other label that he's given, unjustly may I specify, is that of a creep. I honestly don't know why people label him as this. The only reason for this I've seen is his preservation of Rachel's body. Now, if you've played the game and recruited Locke in the World of Ruin, you know what I'm talking about, and you should understand why he did this. After Rachel was killed in the attack on Kohlingen, Locke found her body and paid a herbalist to preserve it. Now, this out of context does sound pretty creepy, but remember that Locke is a treasure hunter in a game with the word fantasy in the title. Of course he knows a treasure that can revive someone. This is the Phoenix Magicite. Is it really creepy to preserve someone's corpse while you search for a magic item to bring them back? I certainly don't think so. The only way this would make Locke creepy is if he preserved Rachel's corpse just out of denial, but that's not the case. The scene where you see Rachel's preserved corpse is shown after Locke explains the Phoenix Magicite, showing his reason for preserving her body. And that, along with some arguments based on his protectiveness towards Tara and Celes, is the only argument towards Locke being a creep. I think the things he did make perfect sense considering his situation, status as a treasure hunter, and knowledge of the Phoenix. I don't mean to tell anyone that they're wrong here, as I may well have missed something. I only wish to provide proper context to Locke's actions and decisions. Also, I just want to say how stupid it is that Cloud from Final Fantasy VII is actually sexist, but nobody cares. But when Locke tries to stop a past mistake from repeating itself, everyone's like, ew. Cloud literally tells Aerith that walking through Sector 5 is too dangerous, despite the fact that she lives there, and walked to the church just fine without him, and keeps saying it even after she fought off soldiers by herself when he couldn't aim a barrel drop, just because she's a woman. And I don't care if it was an attempt to be like him, because of his trauma. Locke's trauma is actually related to being protective. Cloud has the capacity to not do that without any traumatic regrets. There's a big difference between Locke's traumatic death at the hands of Rachel and Cloud's trauma. Maybe Aerith reminded Cloud of him somehow, but that's a huge stretch. I'm not invalidating Cloud's trauma, but I'm not excusing him either. Excuse me. While less widespread egregious misinterpretation exists for Celes, it's definitely worth talking about her. This section will be quite different to the one on Locke, as I need to break down the lore, themes, and parallels around Celes to get my point across. Her mischaracterization is very different to Locke's. Whereas Locke is often characterized as a kind of incel chud loser, Celes is given the opposite treatment, often interpreted as a typical girl boss archetype. This makes sense, as she was a very important general in the Gestalian Empire, having led the attack on Miranda when she was only 16. And by an extent, this is true. Celes was raised as a Magitech soldier, being experimented on by Sid. She was raised to be the perfect, emotionless, objective general, and the Magitech experimentation kind of stripped away her humanity. A very good criticism of the girl boss archetype is that it's an overcorrection. People use the archetype to avoid the dated maiden innocence archetype in media, where the priority lies in making a female character, instead of just writing a character who just so happens to be female. However, while trying to give ambition and clear strength to give humanity to female characters, a lot of the time they're so objective and non-emotional that their human traits are stripped away, just in the other way. I mean, come on. In Star Trek, they made Spock an unemotional, logical character. In fact, he even uses logic as his mantra, as a way to make him an alien, specifically not human. The girl boss archetype is basically just female Spock, so you see where the problem is. But enough build up. What does this have to do with Final Fantasy? Well, Celes' story is one of confliction between the Returners and the Empire. She grew up indoctrinated by the Empire, before being abandoned by them for daring to question their morals, or lack thereof. She was then sort of adopted by the Returners when Locke saved her from her cell in South Figaro. Parallels can be drawn between the Empire and an abusive family. In fact, in some ways they are. Sid was a father, or grandfather, figure to Celes growing up, but while his actions during the events of the game do make him seem like a good character, with how he helps the returners. He was undeniably abusive to Celes growing up. I recommend the video Final Fantasy VI Has a Dark Secret Nobody Talks About by Final Fantasy Union for a deep exploration of Magi-Tech experimentation in the Empire. But the summary is that Gestal invaded the Esper world and captured a load of the inhabitants. Cid experimented infusing magicite into people, starting with Kefka. This led to Kefka's insanity that he's known so well for. Cid then experimented on a young Celes, concluding that Kefka's mental destruction was a result of his age and maturity, whereas Celes was still a child with a much more malleable brain. This was strange, as Cid knew Celes since she was a baby and saw her as sort of a daughter. He put his duties to Gestal way before his concern for morality, knowing well he could have a repeat of the Kefka situation. The experiment went well though, so Celes was taken in by the Empire and trained to be a general. Before we get to the events of the game, let's analyze. This is a clear allegory for an abusive upbringing, with how Cid experiments on Celes, knowing that it could ruin her life, but he did it anyway because his research and pleasing Gestal came first. The first subject was Kefka, the main villain, and one of the most infamous villains in gaming history. Kefka is super insane, so apathetic that he just wants to massacre whole populations and become God and destroy the world just because he wants to see what happens. Kefka's lack of emotion or empathy is the scariest part of him, and that's why he's the villain. He just doesn't care. He's dangerous, with this one man bringing the entire planet to its knees. So imagine not just for the sake of Celes, but for the sake of everyone, if there were two insane Magi-Tech soldiers in the world. Cid did a terrible thing, twice. Kefka was a fully aware member of the Empire, so experimenting on him was just part of the job. However, Celes was, as I said before, a child. Cid used her as a way to advance his research, a child who he supposedly saw as a daughter. Cid abused Celes, not in any way that could happen in real life, but adults putting profit and selfish desires over the well-being of their child is very much a real thing, and likely what was the inspiration behind Celes and Cid's backstory. Real quick tangent, I want to do a comparison between Cid and Hojo from Final Fantasy VII. I will try to be spoiler free since this isn't an FF7 video, but if you've played it, you know what I'm talking about. With Cid's responsibility over the protagonist's problems and the villain, Hojo was always called a villain, but Cid isn't, even though they kinda did the same things. Just want to connect the dots for other series fans. Anyway, that was a lot, especially for a character analysis. But I need you to understand Celes' backstory and how she was raised. Finally, starting on the events of the game, we see Celes locked up, being beaten as a punishment for questioning the Empire. Locke breaks in and saves her due to his aforementioned compulsion. She was then taken in by the returners when they regrouped in Narsh, where she reunited with Terra, now in her right mind. Having someone with a similar background to her with the returners may have warmed her up more to the group. But something even more warming is the fact that the returners gave her a choice. That's the difference. Regardless of who's right and who's wrong in this war, the returners respect everyone's autonomy, as seen when Terra is given the choice to assist them or not, with Terra being treated similarly to Celes by the Empire, but in her case being mind-controlled instead of conditioned. A real piece of advice for helping people in abusive situations is not forcefully removing them, but instead giving them what their abuser isn't: choice. This is the start of Celes growing into her own person, having the choice to be her own person instead of who anybody else says she is. This is a very significant character moment, but there isn't a lot of attention given to her here, as protecting the Esper is the focus. There is, however, another scene that is very much focused on Celes and her character development, a scene I've wanted to talk about now for a while. I'm talking, of course, about the opera scene. Probably the most iconic scene from the game, and what chiseled this game into my heart. This scene has Celes play the role of a very traditionally feminine lead role in an opera in order to hitch a ride on an airship. I'm not recapping why, I've gone on enough tangents. But this role was the opposite of everything Celes was used to. She was raised as this emotionless, objective, strong general with no show of weakness. funnily enough quite like how some of the fans characterize her as. But this opera character, Maria, is the kind of character that the girl boss archetype was meant to combat. She's a helpless princess whose kingdom was taken over by the East, and she's being forced to marry the Prince of the East. This paints her as kind of a damsel in distress, a bit like Princess Peach. This may be considered dated, but what's important is how comfortable Celes feels here. After putting herself in this role, her character develops, specifically in her speech, which was unfortunately lost in translation. In the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VI, up to this point, Celes speaks in a fairly gender-neutral way. Japanese has typically gendered ways of speaking. But crucially, after the opera scene, her speech patterns are distinctly feminine, showing how putting herself in this role made her change how she wanted to present herself, shedding her imperial general persona and throwing it off the castle edge with those flowers. So yes, this makes Celes a trans icon. Everybody comment, we love and support you, Celes. This look at Celes is further supported by the GBA version's introduction of her, saying, "A Magi-Tech knight, forged by the Empire and tempered in battle. None have ever truly known the woman beneath the general's guise." So Celes is a human, relatable character who was raised abusively by the Empire into being the opposite of her true self. What does that have to do with mischaracterization? Well, the archetype I've seen people try to fit Celes into is exactly what the Empire wanted her to be, and it's the mask she threw off when taken in by people who accepted her and respected her autonomy. If you are one of those people who characterize her that way, I just ask you, why? Is it because of a desire to make Final Fantasy VI seem less dated? Or maybe you prefer a cool story over a meaningful one? Whatever the reason, I encourage you to reconsider, taking her character arc into account when painting the character in your head, as trying to force her into the archetype she was conditioned into by the Empire goes against the point of her story. Again with Celes, this is my read of the character. I'm much more confident in this one over Locke, but I'm not immune to mistakes. I just want to break down her character development, and why I don't like the one-dimensional characterization that she can sometimes get, especially when it's kind of character regression. Final Fantasy VI is a very character-focused game, which of course wouldn't be complete without interesting and compelling characters. Locke, a treasure hunter who made a terrible mistake, rather dying than have it repeat, and Celes, an ex-general whose rock-hard exterior cracks and lets her true self show as the story progresses. I've always loved these characters, and even if I messed up a bit with their stories, the point of stories is to resonate with people. From that perspective, I guess there is no mischaracterization afoot here, as people interpret the story the way that resonates with them. But that also allows for discussion, to which I am contributing with this. Of course, I'm not trying to say anyone is wrong, or that you can't enjoy the games if you don't agree with me. Just a conflicting take on the characters may broaden your potential interpretation, and that will be a good thing.